I never expected him to come back. 10 years is a lifetime when you're 25, especially when those years stretch between 18 and now. The years when you're supposed to become someone else, someone new, someone who's forgotten the ache of adolescence. But there he was, standing on my parents' front porch with that same crooked smile, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, as if no time had passed at all. "Noah," he said, and his voice was deeper than I remembered, rougher at the edges. "Long time." That was all. Just my name and those two words that somehow contained the weight of a decade's absence. Daniel had always been economical with language, saying more in the spaces between words than in the words themselves. The years had been kind to him. The gangly awkwardness of his teenage frame had filled out into something solid and certain. I stood frozen in the doorway, aware of my threadbare t-shirt, the coffee stain on my sweatpants, the fact that I hadn't shaved in 3 days. Coming home to care for my mother after her surgery was meant to be anonymous. No one was supposed to see me like this, least of all him. "Dan?" I managed, and my voice cracked like we were 15 again, passing notes in algebra. "What are you? I didn't know you were in town." "Got your address from your mom when I called the hospital to check on her." He shifted the bag higher on his shoulder, eyes never leaving mine. "Thought maybe we could catch up while you're here. It's been..." He paused, and something flickered across his face that I couldn't read. "It's been too long." The late afternoon sun caught in his hair, now cropped shorter than he used to wear it, but still that same golden brown that had always reminded me of autumn. We ended up at the lake. Where else would we go? Our teenage years had been measured in summer days spent on that dock, in winter afternoons skating across its frozen surface. The walking path was the same, though the trees seemed smaller somehow, as if my memory had inflated them to match the outsized feelings of youth. Daniel walked beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost brushed with each step, that familiar rhythm of our bodies moving in sync without trying. "Remember when we stole your dad's beer and got drunk out here?" he asked, as we settled onto the weathered planks of the dock. The sunset painted the water in shades of amber and gold, and for a moment, I could almost see our younger selves there, 16 and invincible, sprawled on these same boards, dizzy with alcohol and possibility. "You got so sick, and I had to help you home without your parents noticing." I laughed despite myself, the memory vivid and visceral. "You made me brush my teeth 3 times before we went inside." Our legs dangled over the edge, not quite touching the water. I was acutely aware of the inches between us, of how easily they could be closed. "And then you slept on my floor so you could wake me up if I started throwing up again." I didn't add the part I remembered most clearly, how I'd watched him sleeping in the thin light of dawn, his face softened and vulnerable, and felt something twist in my chest that I didn't have words for. The conversation flowed easier than I had any right to expect, the years between us collapsing with each shared memory. We talked about his architecture firm in Chicago, my struggling writing career in New York. We talked about old friends from high school who was married, who had kids, who had left town and never looked back. We didn't talk about why we'd lost touch, about the unanswered texts that had eventually stopped coming, about the Christmas cards that arrived with increasingly generic messages until they too ceased. As dusk deepened around us, Daniel suggested fishing, just like old times, and produced 2 collapsible rods from his bag, as if he'd planned this all along. Our hands brushed as we both reached for the same tackle box, and I pulled back as if burned, a flush creeping up my neck. He pretended not to notice, but I saw the small smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth, the same smile he'd worn when he knew a secret I didn't. "Here," he said, handing me the rod, our fingers connecting again in the exchange. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. "Still remember how to bait a hook, city boy? Or has New York made you soft?" The teasing lilt in his voice was achingly familiar, the same tone he'd used when we were 14, and he was teaching me to drive his father's old pickup truck in the empty school parking lot, his hand occasionally covering mine on the gear shift. Fireflies emerged as night fell fully, pinpricks of gold hovering above the dark water. We hadn't caught anything. We never did, even as teenagers. But that had never been the point. The point was sitting shoulder to shoulder in comfortable silence, the gentle rhythm of casting and reeling, the permission to be still together without the pressure of words. I stole glances at his profile, sharper now with adulthood, but still unmistakably Daniel. "I used to dream about this place," he said suddenly, voice quiet enough that it almost merged with the lapping of water against the dock. "When things got hard in Chicago, when work was crushing me, or when dates went badly, I'd close my eyes and see this dock, feel the boards under my feet." He paused, and I could hear the weight of what he wasn't saying. "Sometimes you were here too, in those dreams." My heart stuttered in my chest, and I kept my eyes fixed on the dark horizon, afraid of what my face might reveal if I turned to him. "I never left, in a way," I admitted. "I mean, physically, sure, but part of me is always sitting right here, waiting for something I can't name." I hadn't meant to say that last part, hadn't meant to expose that much of myself so quickly. 10 years was suddenly both an eternity and nothing at all. Without warning, memories flooded back. Not just the sanitized ones we'd been trading like baseball cards, but the ones I'd buried deep. Daniel's arm around my shoulders after I bombed my college interview. The way he defended me ferociously when Jason Miller called me a fag in 11th grade. How he taught me to slow dance before prom, his hand warm and steady at my waist as we swayed in his bedroom to music only we could hear. "Do you remember?" We both started at the same time, then laughed, that synchronicity that had always been effortless between us resurfacing like muscle memory. "You first," he said, bumping his shoulder against mine, the contact brief but electric. I swallowed hard, unsure if I was brave enough to ask what I really wanted to know, why he disappeared from my life, why he was back now, what he wanted from me after all this time. "Do you remember the night before you left for college?" I asked instead, my voice barely audible above the chorus of crickets and frogs that surrounded us. "When we stayed up all night on this dock. It had been our last night together before everything changed, before distance and time and adulthood pulled us in different directions. We talked until sunrise, making promises we couldn't keep about staying friends forever, about nothing changing. Daniel was silent for so long that I thought maybe he didn't remember, that the night that had been seared into my memory was just another forgotten evening to him. But then he nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the moonlight that now silvered the lake. "I remember everything about that night, Noah, everything." There was something raw in his voice that made me turn to look at him fully for the first time since we'd sat down. He was already watching me, his gaze intense and unguarded in a way I'd never seen before. "I remember how you looked in the sunrise," he continued, each word deliberate and careful. "I remember wanting to tell you something so badly that I couldn't sleep for weeks afterward, kicking myself for being too afraid." He set his fishing rod down and shifted to face me more directly. "I've been kicking myself for 10 years, actually." My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the night sounds around us. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe as Daniel inched closer on the dock until our knees were touching. He reached out, hesitated, then gently pushed a strand of hair from my forehead, his fingers lingering against my skin. "I came back because I couldn't stand it anymore," he whispered. "The not knowing, the wondering what might have been if I'd been braver that night." The lamplight from a distant boathouse caught the angles of his face, highlighting cheekbones that had grown sharper with age, casting shadows beneath eyes that hadn't changed at all. Still that impossible shade between green and gold that had always reminded me of sunlight through leaves. I felt 17 again, breathless with wanting something I couldn't articulate, terrified of ruining the most important relationship in my life. "Dan," I started, but he shook his head slightly, and I fell silent. "Let me say this," he murmured, his voice low and urgent. "I've rehearsed it 1,000 times." His hand moved to rest lightly on mine where it lay between us on the dock, his touch tentative, as if I might bolt like a startled deer. "That night, 10 years ago, I was going to tell you that I—" He stopped, took a deep breath, and started again. "I came back because I need to know if what I felt, what I still feel." The moon emerged fully from behind a cloud, bathing us both in silver light. Daniel moved closer still, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the familiar blend of pine, and something uniquely him that had always made my head spin. His eyes searched mine, looking for permission, for reciprocation, for some sign that the years hadn't erased whatever had been building between us back then. And then, with the water lapping gently against the dock and the moon as our only witness, he leaned forward until his lips were at my ear, his breath warm against my skin, as he whispered words that stopped my heart and started it again in the same instant. "I've been in love with you since we were 15, Noah. And I'm terrified that I've waited too long to tell you." His words hung in the air between us, impossible and perfect all at once. I pulled back slightly, needing to see his face, to confirm that this wasn't some cruel joke or dream from which I'd wake alone in my childhood bedroom. Daniel's eyes were wide, vulnerable, filled with a fear I'd never seen in him before. The fear of rejection, of having risked everything and lost. My pulse thundered so loudly in my ears that I wondered if he could hear it too, the physical evidence of my world shifting on its axis. "Say something," he whispered, his voice cracking on the second word. "Noah, please." The moonlight caught the slight tremor in his hands, and I realized with a start that the confident man who had appeared on my doorstep hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone just as terrified as I was. I opened my mouth, closed it again, grasping for words that wouldn't come. How do you respond when the person you've spent a decade trying to forget confesses that they've been carrying the same unspoken weight? "How long have you known?" I finally managed, my voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of water against the dock. It wasn't what I meant to ask, wasn't even close to addressing the enormity of his confession. But it was all I could force past the constriction in my throat. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, perhaps relieved that I hadn't immediately rejected him, hadn't stood and walked away. His eyes never left Jamin as he answered. "I think part of me always knew," he said, "but I couldn't admit it to myself until I was at college, surrounded by people who weren't you. That's when I realized why nothing felt right. Why no friendship measured up, why every relationship felt hollow." He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing in the dim light. "I never stopped thinking about you, Noah, not for a single day." I stood abruptly, needing space, needing air that wasn't saturated with his proximity. The dock creaked beneath my sudden movement, and for a moment I thought Daniel would reach for me, would try to stop me from leaving. But he remained seated, watching me with that quiet patience that had always been his hallmark, giving me the room I needed even when it clearly cost him to do so. I walked to the edge of the dock, staring out at the dark water, trying to organize the chaos of my thoughts. 10 years, I said finally, not turning around. "You had 10 years to tell me this. Why now?" The question emerged harsher than I intended, sharp with the residual hurt of abandonment. Behind me, I heard him sigh. A deep, weary sound that spoke of years of regret. Footsteps approached slowly, giving me every opportunity to move away if I wanted to. I didn't. I stood frozen as he chose to stand beside me, close but not touching, his gaze fixed on the same invisible point in the distance. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I thought it would be easier to let you go than to risk losing you completely, if you didn't feel the same." He paused, and I could feel him looking at me now, though I kept my eyes forward. And then years passed, and it seemed too late, and I told myself you'd moved on, that we both had. Until my dad got sick last month, and suddenly mortality wasn't some abstract concept anymore. I turned to face him then, surprised. "Your dad, is he?" Daniel shook his head, cutting off my question. "He's stable now, heart attack, but they caught it early." A small, sad smile flickered across his face. But sitting in that hospital waiting room, all I could think was that life is too short for regrets this big. Too short not to at least try to find out if... He gestured vaguely between us, words failing him for once. "If there was ever anything real here. On both sides." The night air had grown cooler, or perhaps it was just the shiver that ran through me at his words. 10 years of buried feelings threatened to surface all at once, overwhelming in their intensity. How many nights had I lain awake in my cramped New York apartment, wondering what might have happened if I'd been braver that last night before he left for college? How many relationships had I sabotaged because the other person wasn't him, could never be him? I shouldn't have ambushed you like this, Daniel said into my silence, misinterpreting it as rejection. He took a small step back, creating more distance between us. I'm sorry. We can pretend this never happened. Go back to... I reached out without thinking, gripping his wrist to stop him from retreating further. His pulse raced beneath my fingertips, as frantic as my own. We both stared at the point of contact, my pale fingers against his sun-browned skin. Don't, I said, my voice rough with emotion. Don't take it back. I couldn't look at his face yet, focusing instead on where we touched. I just need time to process this. It's a lot, Dan. 10 years is a long time to wonder, to imagine what might have been different if either of us had found the courage back then. I finally raised my eyes to his, and the hope I saw there nearly undid me. Can we just sit with this for a while? Together? He nodded, and something in his expression softened, the anxiety giving way to tentative relief. Without discussion, we settled back onto the dock, closer now than before, our shoulders touching as we leaned back to look at the stars. The silence between us was charged, but no longer uncomfortable, filled with possibility rather than regret. The night stretched around us, vast and intimate all at once, and neither of us seemed inclined to break its spell with more words. Hours passed like this, the positions of the stars shifting imperceptibly above us. Occasionally, one of us would point out a constellation or a passing satellite, voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile understanding we'd reached. At some point, Daniel's hand found mine in the space between us, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that belied how monumental the gesture felt. We didn't acknowledge it explicitly, both pretending that this casual touch wasn't rewiring everything we thought we knew about each other. Dawn found us still on the dock, shoulders pressed together for warmth, having talked through the night about everything and nothing. We'd carefully avoided returning to his confession, circling it like cautious animals, approaching and retreating in turns. The rising sun painted the lake in shades of pink and gold, reflecting the sky in perfect symmetry. Daniel stood first, offering a hand to pull me up, neither of us commenting on how we continued holding on longer than necessary. Coffee, he suggested, voice rough from our night without sleep. I think we both need it. The normalcy of the question made me smile despite my exhaustion, despite the emotional tidal wave of the past 12 hours. We walked back toward my parents' house in comfortable silence, our strides falling into the same rhythm they always had, as if our bodies remembered how to move in tandem even when our minds were still catching up. The house was quiet when we returned, my mother still asleep, her medication ensuring she wouldn't be up for several more hours. I moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, setting up the coffee maker while Daniel leaned against the counter watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. There was a new awareness between us now, an electricity that sparked whenever our eyes met for too long. 2 sugars, no cream, right? I asked, already reaching for the sugar bowl, remembering his preference from years ago. He looked surprised, then pleased that I'd remembered such a small detail, nodding as he accepted the mug I offered. Our fingers brushed in the exchange, and neither of us pretended not to notice the current that passed between us. We moved to the porch by unspoken agreement, settling into the weathered Adirondack chairs that had been there since we were children. The morning was cool, but not cold, the kind of perfect spring day that seems designed for new beginnings. We sipped our coffee in silence, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life around us. A jogger passed on the sidewalk, a dog walker across the street, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that my world had been completely reordered in the span of a night. What happens now? Daniel asked finally, setting his empty mug on the small table between us. The question hung in the air, deceptively simple, yet impossibly complex. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing both the boy I'd known and the man he'd become, the familiar and the new layered together like geological strata, a history written in the lines around his eyes, the set of his shoulders. I don't know, I admitted, the honesty a relief after a night of careful navigation. I've never done this before, reconnected with someone from my past, especially not someone who was so... I trailed off, unable to find a word that encompassed what Daniel had been to me, what he might still be. Important, I finished lamely, knowing it was insufficient. He nodded anyway, understanding what I couldn't articulate. "Walk with me," he suggested, standing and offering his hand again. I took it without hesitation this time, allowing him to pull me to my feet. We left our empty mugs on the porch and set off with no particular destination in mind, our hands occasionally brushing as we walked, each contact sending ripples of awareness through me. The morning light filtered through the trees, dappling the sidewalk with patterns that shifted with every step. We found ourselves at the old oak tree in the park where we'd spent countless summer afternoons as teenagers, climbing its massive branches or lounging in its shade with books and dreams. It looked smaller now, like everything from childhood does when revisited with adult eyes, but no less magnificent. Daniel approached it reverently, laying a palm against its rough bark as if greeting an old friend. "Remember when you fell from that branch?" he asked, pointing to a spot about 10 feet up. "You sprained your wrist, but refused to tell your parents because you were afraid they wouldn't let you come back." The memory surfaced immediately, the sharp pain, the fear, but mostly Daniel's face hovering above mine, concerned and caring as he helped me up, as he fashioned a makeshift sling from his t-shirt, his chest bare in the summer heat. "You took care of me," I said softly, the words laden with meaning beyond that single incident. "You always did." I moved to stand beside him, my own hand finding a place on the ancient trunk, inches from his. He turned to face me, his back against the tree now, and in his eyes, I saw a question forming, one I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. The space between us seemed to shrink of its own accord, as if we were planets caught in each other's gravity, the pull irresistible and terrifying. "Noah," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to know if there's any chance." He stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. "If you ever felt anything like what I felt, what I feel." The vulnerability in his face undid me completely, the careful walls I'd built over years of his absence crumbling in an instant. My hand moved from the tree to his cheek, the gesture so natural it was as if I'd done it 1,000 times before, though in reality this was the first. His skin was warm beneath my palm, rough with morning stubble. He stood perfectly still, barely breathing, as if afraid any movement might cause me to pull away. "Yes," I said simply, the admission both terrifying and freeing. "Always. I just never had the courage to name it, even to myself." His eyes closed briefly at my words, relief washing over his features before they opened again, now dark with an emotion that made my heart race. What happened next felt inevitable, a moment 10 years in the making. Daniel leaned forward slightly, hesitant, giving me every opportunity to step back, to change my mind. Instead, I moved closer, eliminating the last inches between us until our lips met in a kiss so gentle it was barely there. A question, not a demand. The world narrowed to this single point of contact, everything else falling away, as decades of unspoken longing crystallized into this one perfect moment. The kiss deepened slowly, neither of us willing to rush what had taken so long to find. His hands came to rest lightly at my waist, steadying rather than claiming, and I felt myself lean into his touch, into the solid warmth of him. When we finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, I rested my forehead against his shoulder, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened, by how right it felt despite the years of doubt and distance. "I'm scared," I admitted into the fabric of his shirt, voicing the fear that still lingered beneath the surface of my happiness. "What if we ruin everything? What if this changes us in ways we can't take back?" I felt his chest rise and fall with a deep breath, his hand coming up to cradle the back of my head, fingers threading gently through my hair. The tenderness of the gesture nearly broke me. "It already has changed us," he said softly, his voice rumbling through his chest against my ear. "It changed us that night 10 years ago when neither of us was brave enough to speak. It changed us every day we spent apart, pretending we could be just fine without each other." He pulled back slightly, tilting my chin up to meet his gaze. "The question isn't whether we'll change things, Noah. It's whether we're finally ready to stop pretending." We walked back to the house hand in hand, the weight of his palm against mine both foreign and familiar, like returning to a hometown you've outgrown but still love. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the pavement, and I found myself thinking about time, how it stretches and contracts, how a decade can disappear in a single night, how the future I'd resigned myself to had suddenly split open to reveal new possibilities. My mother was awake when we returned, sitting at the kitchen table with her morning tea, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of our joined hands before a knowing smile crossed her face. "Daniel," she said warmly, "will you be staying for breakfast?" The normalcy of the question, the lack of surprise in her tone, made me wonder how much she had always seen, how much she had understood about us, even when we hadn't understood ourselves. "If that's all right," Daniel replied, squeezing my hand once before releasing it to help her with the dishes she was trying to reach. I watched them move around each other with easy familiarity, my mother asking about his parents, his job, his life in Chicago, as if he'd never left, as if this morning were no different from the countless others when he'd appeared at our breakfast table as teenagers. Later, after eggs and toast and too much coffee, after my mother had tactfully retreated to her room to rest, we found ourselves in the backyard, sitting on the old porch swing that had been there since before I was born. Daniel's arm rested along the back of the seat, not quite touching my shoulders, but close enough that I could feel its presence like a promise. The gentle rhythm of our swinging matched the cadence of our breath, synchronized without effort. "I have to go back to Chicago tomorrow," he said after a while, the words dropping into the peaceful silence between us like stones into still water. I nodded, having expected this, but still feeling the disappointment acutely. "But New York isn't so far," he continued, turning to face me more fully. "And there are trains, and planes, and weekends, and phones that work much better than they did when we were 18. I smiled despite the ache that had formed at the thought of him leaving again. "Are you suggesting a long-distance relationship before we've even established that we're in a relationship at all?" I teased, though the question held real uncertainty beneath its lightness. Daniel laughed, the sound warming me from the inside out, familiar and new all at once. "I'm suggesting," he said, finally letting his arm drop to my shoulders, pulling me slightly closer, "that I'm not willing to lose another 10 years. Not when we've just found our way back to each other." His expression grew serious, eyes searching mine. "Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I want to give it a real chance. Do you?" The question was simple, but the answer meant everything. The difference between retreating back into the safety of what had been and stepping forward into the unknown territory of what could be. I thought about fear and regret, about the emptiness of my apartment in New York, about the way his lips had felt against mine beneath the oak tree. I thought about time and second chances, about how rarely life offers the opportunity to rewrite endings. "Yes," I said, the word carrying the weight of a decade's worth of unspoken feelings. "Yes, I want that too." The smile that broke across his face then was like sunrise, brilliant and full of promise. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against mine, his hand coming up to cup my cheek. Our breath mingled in the small space between us, and I closed my eyes, memorizing the feeling of this moment, storing it away to revisit during the inevitable separations to come. "Then we'll figure it out," he whispered, his thumb brushing gently across my cheekbone. "Day by day." The simple certainty in his voice made me believe it could be that easy, that we could bridge the years and the miles through sheer determination and this fragile, powerful thing growing between us. In the soft light of early morning, with the scent of spring surrounding us and Daniel's warmth beside me, anything seemed possible. His lips found mine again, gentle and unhurried, a seal on the promise we just made. When we parted, the smile we shared held all the words we didn't need to say yet. Acknowledgement of the journey ahead, the obstacles we'd face, but also the conviction that whatever came next, we would face it together. 10 years had brought us back to where we started, but the path forward was entirely new, uncharted but inviting. And this time, neither of us was afraid to take the first step.